It's the police body cam video answering some of the mysteries surrounding the death of Oscar-winning actor Gene Hackman and his wife.
All going there.
We ran around the whole property. It's huge. It's a big property.
Okay.
On February 26, 2025, federal agents stepped through the gates of Gene Hackman's secluded Santa Fe estate, expecting solemn procedure and quiet documentation. Instead, thermal imaging revealed something structural beneath the foundation. A large engineered void not reflected in any accessible plans. Behind a concealed wall in the mansion's private library, accessible through a mechanical sequence rather than a digital keypad, a hidden staircase descended into darkness. What lay below was not a simple panic room. It was a reinforced underground chamber, lined with crates, marked with symbols, and ending in a sealed iron door designed in a way that felt unmistakably institutional. And it forces a larger question. When a private residence contains infrastructure that resembles Cold War architecture, are we looking at eccentric privacy or something built to endure beyond one lifetime? The fortress in the pines. Hackman's estate had always been private. But privacy alone does not usually require perimeter stone walls, reinforced steel gates, layered surveillance systems, and thermal imaging coverage across wooded acreage. The property sits outside Santa Fe, a region known for artistic heritage and desert quiet, but also for something else. Northern New Mexico carries a parallel identity shaped by classified laboratories, weapons research, and hardened facilities dating back to the Manhattan Project. Just miles away lies Los Alamos, where scientists once built the atomic bomb in total secrecy. Entire neighborhoods were erased from maps. Mail was censored. Workers used code names. The project operated in such isolation that even many residents nearby did not fully understand what was happening in the hills above them. During the Cold War, that secrecy did not disappear. It evolved. Federal infrastructure expanded quietly across the Southwest. Underground storage facilities were constructed to withstand nuclear blasts. Hardened command posts were embedded into mountains. Emergency relocation protocols were drafted for continuity of government in the event of catastrophe. Kirtland Air Force Base near Albuquerque became one of the largest storage sites for nuclear weapons in the country, much of it supported by underground vaults and reinforced containment structures. New Mexico's geology made this possible. Volcanic tuff and dense sedimentary formations allowed engineers to carve stable subterranean chambers with minimal collapse risk. Unlike regions with shifting water tables or unstable clay soils, northern New Mexico offered natural advantages for long-term underground durability. This context matters because when investigators descended into the hidden chamber beneath Hackman's estate, they did not find improvised drywall or hobbyist engineering. They found reinforcement consistent with long-term load-bearing construction. The materials appeared decades old. The tunnel walls were not simply hollowed earth. They were supported with structural integrity that suggested foresight rather than improvisation. The reinforcement patterns resembled those used in mid-century protective structures designed to absorb pressure and resist environmental degradation. The concealed entrance was mechanical, not electronic, a counterintuitive choice in a digital age, but one that engineers often prefer for redundancy. Mechanical systems are harder to hack, immune to power failures, and capable of functioning long after electronic systems degrade. In high-security facilities, mechanical overrides are often preserved precisely because they do not depend on modern infrastructure. The more investigators examined the structure, the clearer it became that this was not a space designed for temporary concealment. It was designed for continuity. An archive preserved in stone. At the bottom of the stairs, agents entered a broad subterranean chamber that felt less like a hiding place and more like an archive frozen mid-process. Wooden crates, some dating back decades, lined the perimeter. Many had deteriorated, spilling yellowed documents leather-bound notebooks, and rusted metallic objects across the stone floor. The air was cool and slightly damp, conditions that, paradoxically, can slow certain forms of paper decay when airflow is minimal. Archivists have long noted that stable underground temperatures, often hovering between 50 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit, can preserve paper more consistently than fluctuating above-ground climates. In some historical repositories, subterranean vaults were intentionally used to shield sensitive materials from fire, humidity swings, and ultraviolet exposure. The walls bore markings that immediately drew attention. Some resembled alchemical notation historically used to encode chemical processes in early modern Europe, where scholars disguised experimental formulas as symbolic diagrams to prevent intellectual theft. Others looked closer to engineering schematics, layered diagrams, with measurements and structural annotations reminiscent of mid-20th century drafting conventions, where calculations were often handwritten directly onto wall surfaces during active construction phases. The symbols did not appear decorative. They followed repeating patterns, as though they formed part of a system rather than spontaneous expression. On the chamber floor, circular etchings formed a geometric layout that, when photographed from above, bore resemblance to celestial charts. The alignments echoed the structure of star mapping systems used historically to track seasonal shifts and navigational orientation. From ancient desert observatories in the American Southwest to European monastic crypts aligned with solstices, subterranean spaces have sometimes been designed with astronomical reference points embedded into their architecture. Star mapping in underground structures is not unprecedented. Military planners during the Cold War occasionally incorporated astronomical reference charts into hardened facilities as a backup navigational framework in the event of electromagnetic disruption affecting satellite systems. Whether symbolic or functional, the presence of such markings suggests intentional design rather than aesthetic whim. Among the crates were photographs of unidentified individuals gathered in what appeared to be private interiors. Some images showed formal table settings arranged with deliberate symmetry. Others depicted architectural backdrops not immediately identifiable, possibly older estates or institutional buildings. The accompanying notes, written in hurried handwriting, referenced meetings and dates without full context, suggesting documentation of events rather than personal memoir. There was no index explaining the material, no clear categorization, only preservation. And preservation without explanation often signals that interpretation is meant to be restricted. At the far end of the chamber stood the feature that shifted the investigation from curiosity to tension: a riveted iron door. The door designed not to invite entry. The iron door was constructed of thick steel plating. It had no visible handle on the outer surface, no keypad, no obvious hinge mechanism exposed. Its rivet pattern and structural composition resembled designs used in mid-20th century hardened installations. During the Cold War, blast-resistant doors were often built with external smooth surfaces to prevent tampering. Entry mechanisms were typically internal or concealed behind secondary locking systems. The absence of exterior hardware was intentional. A protruding handle or hinge creates structural weakness under pressure. Smooth plating distributes force more evenly during shock events. In high-security facilities constructed during the 1950s and 1960s, including hardened missile silos and command bunkers, steel doors were frequently layered with internal locking bars that engaged laterally into reinforced concrete frames. Some designs included gasket seals to protect against pressure waves or chemical intrusion. While there is no public confirmation that this door includes such features, the visual similarities are difficult to dismiss. In facilities such as Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado, engineered to withstand nuclear blast shock waves, entrance doors weigh many tons and are balanced with precision hinge systems concealed within reinforced frames. Throughout the American Southwest, Lesser-known hardened sites were built using scaled-down versions of the same principles: redundancy, isolation, containment. What makes the door beneath the estate striking is not simply its weight or thickness, but its proportion relative to the chamber preceding it. The reinforced corridor narrows slightly as it approaches the threshold, a design feature often used in protective architecture to funnel structural stress away from critical entry points. The surrounding masonry appears denser near the doorway, suggesting additional reinforcement. Authorities have not publicly disclosed what lies beyond the door. Whether it leads to another chamber, a sealed vault, or a terminated corridor remains unconfirmed. That silence has amplified speculation. However, speculation alone does not establish intent. What can be established is this: the chamber leading to the door appears overbuilt for casual storage. The scale and reinforcement exceed what most private citizens would require for document preservation. Santa Fe's broader geography adds another layer of complexity. In addition to Los Alamos, the region includes Kirtland Air Force Base near Albuquerque, historically associated with weapons storage and underground facilities. Declassified Cold War continuity of government planning confirms that portions of the Southwest were evaluated for subterranean redundancies in case of catastrophic events. Hardened archives, fallback command posts, and secure storage sites were quietly embedded across the region's terrain. The question that lingers is whether the tunnel beneath the estate was an isolated construction, or whether it connected, historically or structurally, to something larger embedded in the land decades ago. If it was built entirely by a private owner, it represents an extraordinary commitment to long-term secrecy. If it predated the estate and was integrated into it, the narrative shifts dramatically. Neighbors, noises, and patterns of silence. Residents in the surrounding forested enclave have long described the estate as unusually controlled. Hackman was known to be private, especially after retiring from public life. Neighbors described brief but cordial interactions, yet some recalled cryptic remarks referencing loyalty and betrayal, though none could point to specific threats or incidents. More intriguing were accounts of mechanical sounds beneath the ground during late hours. These were described not as plumbing or HVAC systems, but as low, industrial hums. While there is no verified documentation linking these sounds to subterranean operations, the recollections have resurfaced since the tunnel's discovery. Several longtime residents noted that the sounds were not constant. They appeared in intervals, sometimes weeks apart, often beginning after midnight and fading before dawn. A few described a faint vibration underfoot, subtle enough to question whether it was imagined. Dogs reportedly reacted on certain nights, pacing or barking toward the tree line before abruptly settling. None of these details, taken individually, establish anything concrete. Together, however, they form a pattern difficult to dismiss outright. Deliveries to the estate were similarly discreet. Trucks arrived without company logos, according to two neighbors, and were typically gone within an hour. Supplies were unloaded inside enclosed garages rather than in open driveways. Again, such precautions are common among high-profile homeowners seeking privacy. Yet the consistency of the procedure, combined with the timing of the reported mechanical activity, has prompted retrospective scrutiny. Several contractors associated with renovations over the decades reportedly signed strict non-disclosure agreements. That is not unusual for high-profile estates. What has drawn attention, however, is how little documentation remains publicly accessible regarding structural modifications made to the property in the 1990s and early 2000s. Permit archives from that period show routine filings, roof work, landscaping, electrical upgrades, but gaps appear where more substantial alterations might have been expected. Whether those records were misplaced, sealed, or never digitized remains unclear. Local historians who attempted to trace the estate's architectural lineage encountered administrative gaps. Again, such gaps are not proof of wrongdoing, but repeated absence creates narrative tension. Patterns of silence can be coincidental, or they can be intentional. The estate above ground projected refinement and calm. Beneath it, there was a network engineered for durability. The contrast is difficult to ignore. Private belief or institutional continuity. Official reports state that Hackman and his wife died of natural causes. There has been no public declaration connecting their deaths to criminal activity or to the underground chamber discovered beneath the estate. That remains the factual anchor. Yet the existence of that concealed space complicates the final chapter of his life. Why maintain an elaborate subterranean infrastructure into advanced age? Why preserve documents and structured markings that suggest systematic organization? Why incorporate reinforcement elements commonly associated with mid-century hardened facilities? One explanation is personal contingency planning. During the Cold War, many Americans constructed private bunkers, driven by fear of nuclear escalation. Some were sophisticated, engineered for durability and long-term survival. Another possibility is archival preservation. Public figures often safeguard correspondence, research, and sensitive materials. For individuals who value privacy intensely, extraordinary measures can feel justified. But a third possibility deserves attention. Northern New Mexico carries a documented legacy of classified research sites, contingency infrastructure, and repurposed government-era construction. In some cases, private estates were developed atop or adjacent to decommissioned facilities. If the chamber predated its most recent occupant, then the narrative shifts. Hackman may not have built the structure, but inherited it. In that scenario, the story becomes less about secret ambition and more about stewardship, the maintenance or adaptation of something already embedded in the land. Above ground, the estate projected artistic taste, wealth, and deliberate retreat. Below ground, investigators encountered reinforcement, preserved materials, and a sealed iron threshold, suggesting containment rather than improvisation. The discovery proves nothing. It confirms no institutional involvement. It rewrites no established history. But it challenges assumptions about where privacy ends and infrastructure begins. Until the iron door's interior is fully disclosed, architecture remains the only evidence. And architecture speaks in its own language, the language of permanence. What remains buried may ultimately prove ordinary. But until explained, the tension endures.